Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to the Rancher Podcast. I have what I think is a very unique episode today because it really runs the gamut as far as topics go. This one's going to have a little bit of Texas history, some geography, politics, some broken barriers, a little bit of bloodshed, and even a tie-in to the founding of an important educational institute that is still around today. So, if you wouldn't mind, stick around to find out more about the ranching pioneer Miss Mabel Doss Lea and the Fence Cutting War of 1883. I'm proud to have Elite Ranch Consulting as one of the first sponsors of the Rancher Podcast. Elite Ranch Consulting is your one-stop shop for protecting your real estate investment. Whether you inherited a piece of land, bought a ranch as your vacation home, or are simply looking to maximize the land you already own, Elite Ranch Consulting's team of experts can help you make the right decisions to make your land profitable. Visit EliteRanchConsulting.com today to learn more about how they can help you protect your American dream. The reason I find today's story so unique is that it put Texas in such a crisis that the governor actually had to force the legislature to reconvene to address this issue and a few smaller ones in 1884. And as someone who works for the state legislature and has just gone through 2 special sessions, looking at a third one coming up at the end of the month, I know all too well how hard it is to get this group together every other year for the regular session, but much less a special session, which is really only going to focus on fencing in 1884, when trains, stagecoaches, and horses were the only way that these legislators were going to be able to get to the state. It's interesting. We always talk about here in Texas, our legislature, like I said, only meets every other year for a set number of months or a set number of days, and we actually don't do anything for the first couple months. And people always say, why aren't you guys voting on anything? You don't have much time to do this. And the explanation has always been that back in the day, people might not have found out that they had won their election until the middle of November, maybe even in December, and if there was a runoff even later than that. And with the legislative session starting in the first week of January, it was kind of hard for some of them to be able to actually travel from wherever they were in the state to the Capitol. So that's why there was that period. It was also a period for people to get to know each other better and rebuild the familiarity before the legislation actually started. And I find it interesting because that plays into this. I mean, it's really quite remarkable that they were able to pull the legislators in for this, so it must have been a really big issue. So what exactly prompted this call from the governor? Well, you might be asking yourself, barbed wire? It was actually a pretty important thing. I know people make jokes today about barbed wire museums and whatnot, but I've always found barbed wire to be a pretty interesting thing. And it had been patented only 10 years earlier when there was a farmer named Joseph Glidden in Illinois who had patented it in 1860s or in 1874. And he wasn't the first one to think of it, but he was the first one that put the patent on it, so we're going to just go ahead and give him a little bit of credit there. But what he really did actually was he figured out a way to mass produce this wire, and it really became the quickest and easiest way for these ranchers, these owners of all these animals, to be able to fence them in and protect them, and also protect their land. So just as the barbed wire fence was being created, the cattle drives were really at their apogee. People were driving, as we talked about in the Chisholm Trail, they were driving cattle from South Texas all the way up into the northern states. We talk about Kansas was a big hub, but they moved out into Wyoming, Colorado. All of these places were just wide open spaces. I mean, some of them still are today, but there's a lot more fencing around. But at that time, there was no such thing. And so really, as they were just hitting this peak, barbed wire fence comes along and essentially leads to their demise. According to the Texas State Historical Society, the West Texas Plains and the Panhandle that had once played host to these mythical cattle drives was almost completely fenced in by 1885. So, again, 1873, the patent for barbed wire fence comes around, and within 10 years, the entirety of West Texas and the Panhandle is almost completely fenced in. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of time that would have to go into that. And for it to be done in 10 years just shows how much these ranchers wanted this protection and how excited they were to have it. So the migration to West Texas, had started in earnest after the Civil War. A lot of people wanted to move out of the war-torn South or find new ways of making money. A lot of men wanted to put the past behind them and move with their families out to different parts of the country. So West Texas is actually getting settled pretty well. You factor into that as well that the state of Texas actually gifted a lot of its veterans of the war land, and it was quite the booming area actually. And one of those immigrants was Miss Mabel Doss Lea. And you might be asking, who is Miss Mabel Doss Lea? She's not someone that's necessarily talked about too much in U.S. history classes, but I think she should be. And here's her story and why I think that should be. Now, Miss Doss Lea was originally from Missouri, and she moved to Sherman, Texas with her brother in 1873. And she originally just thought she was going to go move to Texas. Sherman is a community that's in the northern part of the state, think kind of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex area. So she had moved to that part of the state, and she started a music class in that town. So she was teaching the young children there, all the way up through adults, how to sing, and probably having a great time. It's a great thing to be the center of attention. I mean, at that time, obviously, there was no TV or radio, so I'm sure that Miss Lee's class was a popular one, and plenty of people would come and hang out just to listen to those folks sing. Well, she married Austinite William H. Day, known as Willie Day, 6 years later in 1879, and the newlyweds moved to Coleman County in 1880. Now, if you don't know much about Coleman County, their 85,000 acres were near the present O.H. Ivy Lake, and there's a community there called Lee Day, which is named for Miss Mabel, because obviously her last name when she got married was Day, and it was originally Lee. But the Coleman County area is just west of Brownwood. It encompasses a really nice part of the hill country on into the western plains. It's a really interesting geographical area, and I would really encourage you to look up that. Or if you haven't noticed by now, I actually have started a YouTube channel, and this audio will be playing on YouTube. I typically like to post photos in a type of slideshow to kind of illustrate what I'm talking about. So you can go and visit my YouTube link. It's the Rancher Podcast on YouTube to probably see some photos of the county and whatnot, because I plan on posting those there. But when Willie Day and Miss Mabel Doss Lea Day moved out to this area, they actually decided to fence the property. So again, let's think about this. This was 1879, 1880s, and like the Historical Association of Texas said, in between 74 and 85, this area became fenced in. So we're right in the middle of that time, in 1880. And he decided to fence in 40,000 acres of this property. So him and Miss Mabel moved out onto the ranch and started supervising a 20-man crew that got to work on this monumental task. But unfortunately, it was a little over a year into buying the property that William H. Day died after being trampled by his horse, who had been spooked by stampeding cattle, which, is honestly something that's probably a pretty terrible way to go. We see it happen in movies all the time. I know it's actually stampeding cattle was a very, very successful tactic of the Native Americans at the time, because they knew how deadly stampeding cattle could be, because they can trample you themselves, or they can work up your horses, run your horses off. There's all kinds of things. So that's a really sad story. I mean, just a little over a year into their marriage and moving out to the middle of nowhere, and now Miss Mabel Day is on her own. So William left her with a 6-month-old and a pile of debt to contend with. But that didn't stop Miss Mabel. The Texas State Historical Association says that by 1883, she actually operated the largest fenced ranch in all of Texas. So she kept going with that fence and got it done. And she managed to keep every single acre that had been left to her through her marketing and business acumen. She became a pillar of the community and was well known in the ranching world for her ability to cut deals, and was just a force to be reckoned with. But unfortunately, the fence cutting war was about to change her fortune. So consider you had grown up in the Texas or the western states that Charles Goodnight and the Nelson stories of the world had grown up in, and you see these men with their own two hands go out and round up Texas longhorns, drive them up north, and make a massive profit and build themselves these empires throughout the West Texas plains. Now, imagine that's what you grew up on, and it's finally your time, and you start to drive cattle, and all of a sudden, there is a literal obstacle to your profession in front of you. A physical fence is stopping you and your cattle from going north. Cattlemen had ran these large herds over the vast expanses with no regard or consideration for who owned that property. In fact, branding wasn't just used to help identify stolen cattle. Branding actually came from this idea that when you had cattle, you would just turn them all out, and they were on communal grazing lands. Everyone obviously had a little bit of a ranching operation, but they would turn them out into the quality pastures in the area, and there would be a roundup. And that roundup, you would have your branded cattle, and you would sort them out depending on the brand to each individual person. And so that's where you get the term roundup and the use of the brand. And there's pretty interesting stories about all that, and I'll talk about roundups in more detail in the future. But the idea of a fenced off grazing pasture was just unheard of. And I'm not taking up for the fence cutters, but you just have to think that they grew up in this world, and then all of a sudden it was their time, and the rules had changed. So when people like Willie Day started fencing off their property and denying these young cattlemen access to their fields, some people got pretty upset. And you're probably thinking that they had no right to be upset and that they should respect private property. And I agree with you. But, on top of everything I just told you about how the rules had kind of changed on these young men, the fencers were not really that completely faultless. There were reports of men, and these are verified reports I found through the Texas State Historical Association and the Legislative Reference Library of Texas, that they were putting up fences on property that they didn't even own. They were placing fences across public roads, and they were denying access to things like schools and towns through fencing. So it's not just that cattle were being denied entry into these fields and whatnot, but I can imagine if today, I was heading to work and stopped by to grab a coffee somewhere and turned back onto the interstate, and all of a sudden there was a barbed wire fence in the road, I would be pretty angry because I'm now late for work and someone's decided that they own the highway. So, as much as the whole idea of private property needs to be respected, it's kind of hard to, find anybody that was blameless in this. Obviously, on both sides, there were folks that were not, committing the worst of the worst. I mean, obviously, I don't think that there's any account that Miss Lee Day, Miss Mabel Doss Lea Day, ever fenced off property that wasn't hers or ever fenced over roads. So, there were victims in this, but both sides weren't completely clear. So, Miss Mabel actually reported to have had her southern fences cut to shreds in September of 1883. And, there had been a really, really bad drought in 1883, which kind of led to the more desperate fence cutting measures that were occurring across the state, especially in the western part of the state. But it's got to be really heart wrenching when your husband's passed away and you guys had worked for a full year to get an entire property fenced in, and someone comes along with a pair of cutters and just tears it to shreds in a matter of hours probably. So while these cattle were needing grass and water due to the drought, the brazenness of these groups became worse and worse. So what was Mabel going to do about it? Well, she could have gone out there and stood in the pasture like old John Dutton in Yellowstone and fire off a few rounds and stand her ground, but that didn't work for some other folks that had tried that. In fact, there are records that the fence cutting war did turn deadly, and that there were some skirmishes between the cutters and the ranchers themselves that ended in 3 deaths across the state. So the bands of fence cutters had given themselves these nicknames like the Javelinas and the Blue Devils, and they were getting more and more brazen, like I mentioned earlier. And it was estimated that the damages ranged near $20 million, which, I mean, think about that, $20 million in the 1880s. I mean, that is hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. They said that there were $30 million worth of property valuations that were reduced because of this. And again, those 3 deaths. So this war was like many wars, in that it was, destructive, and it was tearing people apart, and, it ultimately was deadly. But Miss Mabel had a better idea than standing out in the field and potentially getting shot. She went and contacted the governor. And specifically, she was quoted in a local newspaper, and a few days later, the governor relented, but we'll get into that in a minute. So, calling a special session in Texas is no easy task, as I mentioned earlier. Even the most pressing of issues is typically going to have to wait until the next session meets, which again is every 2 years. I mean, after Hurricane Harvey, there was a lot of money and things that needed to be appropriated, and the governor exercised his emergency powers, but there was no legislative session called. And, this isn't a political podcast, so you can disagree or agree with that, but those are the facts. I mean, major things happen without a special session being called. But fence cutting was top of the list, and members were hearing from their constituents. Again, the Historical Association of Texas said that there was a report that at least half of the counties in the state of Texas had at least one fence cutting reported. So something had to be done. When something reaches this type of level in the popular imagination or in the news or in the media, where it's happening in every other county, I'm sure legislators were hearing from their people at whatever town halls or letter writing or whatever, however you contacted your legislator at that time. I'm sure they were hearing from them. So it seems that this was not all about fence cutting, though, and that he actually used the fence cutting as a bit of bait. So Governor John Ireland put on the legislative call the fence cutting issue, but he also brought in some taxing issues and lots of education policy issues. And I don't think you've probably ever heard of Governor Ireland. He's not really one of the ones that we talk about in Texas history, but he is an important one. And probably not a very well loved one, but an important one, because he is the man who championed the creation of property taxes. So, every year when you get your bill, feel free to thank Governor Ireland for authorizing the taxation of your property. So I'm sure he wasn't the most popular man. Somehow he got 50 or 51% of the folks to vote for him here in Texas, but enacting property tax, that's got to be a pretty tough campaign to run on. So he probably was looking for something that would make him more popular, and the fence cutting issue was just the thing. Another issue that he had done was he had started selling off the lands to ranchers, which is what ultimately led to this fencing predicament. So he probably felt some type of blame that he had sold a lot of the state's land out to these folks that had, built these vast fiefdoms and fenced them in. So I actually found a little excerpt from the Legislative Reference Library, and here's what they had to say about the whole fence cutting special session. It said, Mabel Day became one of the leading voices in urging the legislature to action. Her letter to the editor of the Coleman Voice was reprinted in several newspapers across the state, including the October 11th, 1883 Austin Weekly Statesman. She said, "For my part, I think men who destroyed 5 miles of my fence last week could have as much justice with my burnt house." And I would like to address a question to the stockman of this section. Is there no recourse for us in this matter? Should you, as business and law-abiding men, adopt any plan to protect your property, I would beg to be considered as one amongst you. And I know that quote sounds a bit difficult, it was 19th century English, but essentially what she was saying is that these people have essentially burned your house. When they cut your fence, they are encroaching upon your property, and they are violating your personal safety. And so she calls on her fellow ranchers to say that, we're upstanding citizens and we need this to change. Well, just a few days later, on October 15th, like I said, that letter had been published on October 11th. The Legislative Reference Library says that on the 15th, Governor John Ireland called that special session of the 18th Legislature to convene in January of 1884 and address 14 topics, which would include to consider and provide a remedy for wanton destruction of fences. In his message to the legislature when they convened, Governor Ireland casted blame on both the ranchers and the fence cutters. The House Committee on Fence Cutting was formed, and several versions of the bills to address the matter were introduced. Now, just an aside, the idea that they created the House Committee on Fence Cutting is awesome. Typically we have standing committees in the legislature, things like finance, health and human services, rural ag and water affairs, and from time to time special committees are created. I know we had one this summer on the future of college sports in Texas, talking about the exit of University of Texas from the Big 12. But I would have loved to have been the clerk for the House Committee on Fence Cutting. But back to what the Legislative Reference Library said. So they said that several versions of bills were introduced and much debate ensued. A central point of the dispute for the lawmakers was whether punishment should be equal for illegal fence cutting and illegal fence building. So again, as I mentioned earlier, this was not a one-sided problem. Both sides had very valid concerns about what was happening, and so apparently there was a pretty big dispute because of lobbying from both of these sides about whether or not the punishment should be equal. But in the final January 31, so they got this done in a month, which is typically how long special sessions last. In that final January 31st vote on House Bills 2, House Bill 8, and House Bill 9, Representatives Wortham, Galt, Garrison, and Burns are the only ones recorded as voting no, and they said, "We vote no because we believe that the punishment for unlawful fencing of land and the cutting of fence should be alike." That is to say, if the crime of fence cutting is declared a felony, the unlawful fencing of land should also be declared a felony. To do otherwise will very naturally be construed to mean class legislation and create widespread dissatisfaction, well calculated to aggravate the evil that is now afflicting the state. Furthermore, the Legislative Reference Library says, however, the bills passed in a 71-22 vote, and the acts of the 1884 first called session set out punishments for fence cutters, and furthermore, there were general laws that required gateways in every 3 miles of fencing. Faced with jail times, the fence cutters put down their wire cutters, and the ranch owners installed gates. So, from that we can deduce that there was not an equal punishment for the cutters versus the fencers, which, again, like the gentleman said, was likely born out of class. I mean, your ranchers were likely more wealthy than these men that were cutting their fences. So you ended up with felonies for folks that cut fences, and just likely a fine, a civil penalty for those who did not install the gates every 3 miles. But there you have it. Miss Mabel brought the legislature to town and got the issue fixed without shedding any blood, which, was actually quite the feat in 19th century Texas politics. We can talk about a lot of stories like that, but I think my friend over at Wise About Texas is probably the best person. He's got a lot of great episodes about Texas politics in the 19th century, and you can learn about some of the bloodshed that occurred there. Well, having won the war, Miss Mabel went home and married her second husband, who was Captain J.C. Lee of Roswell, New Mexico. And while she did move to New Mexico, she retained most of the land and ranch in Coleman County. And she went about actually settling hundreds of families on that land. So when she moved to New Mexico, that's when the communities started encroaching even more into the West, and she actually successfully used her business and marketing to sell off some of her land to these people that were moving out there and establish a community. But she also left 10,000 acres to her daughter, who would have them debt-free when she died. But that was not her only legacy. Back in New Mexico, her and Captain Lee founded a school. And this wasn't any ordinary school. In fact, they founded the New Mexico Military Institute. I know a few people that went to NIMI, as they call it, NIMI, and it's a school that continues to this day to churn out young men of character and prepare them for lives of public service, whether or not that's in our United States military or in public service like politics or local government. And furthermore, adding to her list of accomplishments, Miss Mabel was actually appointed the Lady Commissioner of the World's Fair in St. Louis, which was owing to her strong leadership and communication skills. And if you don't know much about World's Fairs, they were something that were very, very popular in the 19th and early 20th century. And they were essentially, a years-long, think kind of like the Olympics, a years-long thing that happened every few years or a months-long thing that would happen every few years that would really, like it says, the World's Fair, it would exhibit things from across the world. So, it was reported that there were folks from the Arctic that came and set up a habitat like what they lived in at home, and they kind of showed people how they survive. There's also very cool exhibitions about the future and technology, and specifically this one, there was the first ever prototype of a wireless phone, along with an X-ray and a very rudimentary fax machine. But the big one that year was the personal car. So in 1904, cars had kind of been around for a little while. The internal combustion engine had been created, but it wasn't for a few more years that the personal car would become as mainstream as it was. So this was the first time that the personal car had been shown off. But Miss Mabel was a big part of that. So to wrap it all up, I think what you should probably do is the next time you're driving down those long roads that are lined with miles and miles of fence, whether you're in Kansas or Oklahoma or Texas or any of the other western states, Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, any of them, I think you should probably think about Miss Mabel and also her first husband, Willie Day, and the countless other ranchers and day laborers that have put in those hours and hours of backbreaking work to put up those fences. But you should also acknowledge how successfully she stood up and fought for the right to protect that land, because very well they could have made a law that you couldn't fence in land, and that would have really reshaped the way that we look at our society. and our Western society specifically. Well, that is all for today's episode. I want to thank you again for continuing to support the Rancher Podcast. Please don't forget to subscribe and rate and review this podcast. If you haven't rated it already, if you listen on Apple Podcasts, one of the ways that they help other people find things that they're interested in is through the rating and reviews. So just go ahead and click on the profile for the Rancher Podcast and scroll your finger to the bottom, and you'll find the area where you can rate, give it a 1 to 5 star review, and then you can also write in a review. And if you would do that, I would greatly appreciate it, because it would help other folks find it.